Midnight was when the story stopped being a rumor and started becoming a timeline, because the moment investigators reopened the sequence of events, everything that had been dismissed as gossip suddenly turned into timestamps, movements, calls, and one very uncomfortable question that nobody in Montecito wanted to answer: where exactly was Harry when the first piece of evidence changed hands, and why did he quietly delay his return right when the timeline started to shift? That is the part nobody can explain cleanly. And when a timeline stops making sense, investigators don't look at statements anymore. They look at silence, and according to people who have seen the internal discussions, it wasn't what was said that triggered concern, it was what wasn't said. The gaps, the missing hours, the rescheduled flights, the sudden change of plans that turned what was supposed to be a short trip into an extended stay away from the Montecito mansion. And the more that timeline was pulled apart, the more uncomfortable the sequence began to look. Because here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. When investigators reopened the timeline, they weren't looking at one day, they were reconstructing an entire week, hour by hour, movement by movement, phone call by phone call, and somewhere in that reconstruction, something didn't line up with the original version of events that had been quietly circulating before. Flights that were booked but not taken, calls that were made but not logged in the usual way, a vehicle leaving Montecito at a time that didn't match the public version of the schedule. And suddenly, the phrase delayed return stopped sounding like a personal decision and started sounding like a legal strategy, because delaying a return changes jurisdiction, changes interview timing, changes who can ask questions and when. And that is where people started whispering that this wasn't a travel delay, this was a timeline delay. The problem with timelines is that they don't care about narratives. Narratives can be adjusted, statements can be rewritten, but timestamps don't change, flight manifests don't change, security gate logs don't change. And when investigators start putting those pieces together, they don't look for dramatic moments, they look for small inconsistencies. Because small inconsistencies are where big problems start. And according to what's being quietly discussed behind the scenes, the timeline investigators are now focusing on isn't the day the story broke, it's the days before that. The quiet days, the days nobody was paying attention, the days when movements looked normal until someone went back and looked again and realized that normal and accurate are not always the same thing. What makes this more explosive is that the timeline reopening reportedly happened after new digital records were reviewed. And digital records are brutal because they don't forget. Entry logs, signal pings, encrypted message timestamps, all the invisible things people never think about until someone prints them out and lays them side by side, and suddenly a story that sounded simple starts looking complicated. Very complicated. And that is exactly when Harry's return reportedly got delayed again and again and again, each delay explained publicly as scheduling issues, private matters, security considerations, but privately, people started asking a different question. Was the return being delayed because of what was happening at Montecito, or because of who was asking questions about Montecito? Inside certain circles, there's a phrase they use when a situation starts tightening, but nobody wants to say it out loud. They call it buying quiet time. Not running, not hiding, buying time. Time for lawyers to talk, time for documents to be reviewed, time for people to get their stories straight, time for investigators to finish asking the first round of questions before the next round begins. And the reason this phrase keeps coming up now is because the timeline being reopened didn't just affect one person, it affected everyone who was in that house, everyone who visited that house, everyone who worked in that house. Because once a timeline is reopened, every person becomes a timestamp. And that is when the Montecito mansion reportedly went very quiet. Not normal quiet, strategic quiet. Fewer visitors, fewer public movements, fewer appearances, fewer photos. And when a house that used to be full of activity suddenly becomes silent while investigators are reconstructing a timeline, people notice, neighbors notice, staff notice, delivery drivers notice. Silence is very loud when people are expecting movement. But the most interesting part of all of this is not the delay itself. It's what the delay suggests. Because delaying a return only matters if the timeline matters. And the timeline only matters if investigators believe that something important happened during a specific window of time. And if that window of time overlaps with when certain people were present, certain items were moved, certain calls were made, then the timeline stops being background information and starts becoming the entire case. And suddenly, the question is no longer why did Harry delay his return? The real question becomes what happened during the time he didn't come back? Because investigators don't reopen timelines for no reason. They reopen timelines when new evidence forces them to look at the sequence again. And when the sequence changes, the story changes. And when the story changes, people start delaying flights, extending stays, and making very quiet decisions behind very large gates in Montecito, while somewhere else in a very quiet office, someone is building a new version of events based not on what people said happened, but on what the timeline says happened. And the reason timelines are so dangerous is because they don't accuse anyone, they don't speak, they don't speculate, they just sit there in silence with dates and times and locations, and the longer investigators stare at them, the more the empty spaces start to look like answers instead of gaps. And that is exactly where this story moves from uncomfortable to explosive. Because once a timeline is reopened, investigators don't just look at where someone was, they look at who knew where someone was, and whether the public version of events was built before or after those movements were quietly rearranged. And that is where the delay starts to look less like a personal decision and more like a coordinated pause. The kind of pause that happens when lawyers start saying things like, wait, and not yet, and we need to see what they have first. Because behind the scenes, what people don't realize is that timeline reconstruction usually happens in phases. First, they build the movement map, flights, cars, entries, exits. Then they build the communication map, calls, messages, emails. And then they overlay the two maps on top of each other and look for moments where movement and communication intersect at exactly the wrong time. That intersection is where pressure begins. Because if a call happens right before a movement or right after a movement, investigators start asking what was known before that movement happened. And if someone leaves a location right after a certain call, that call becomes very interesting. And this is why the phrase reopen timeline is making people nervous, because it means investigators already had a timeline before and something new forced them to rebuild it. Something didn't fit, something appeared late, something changed the order of events. And when the order of events changes, even slightly, it can change who knew what and when they knew it. Now here is where the story becomes even more complicated, because while the timeline was being reconstructed, there were reportedly new questions about who had access, not just physical access, but digital access, access to accounts, access to records, access to storage, access to things that most people never think about until investigators start making lists. Access lists are dangerous because they are very short, and the shorter the list, the closer investigators look at the names on it. And during this period, while those lists were being quietly built, Harry still did not return. Days passed, then more days passed, and every extra day away created more speculation, more pressure, more questions. Because if everything was simple, if everything was explainable, if everything matched the original version of events, there would be no reason to stay away while a timeline was being rebuilt piece by piece. Inside certain legal circles, there is another phrase that has started floating around very quietly, very carefully. Sequence risk, not evidence risk, sequence risk. Because sometimes the problem isn't what happened, it's when it happened, and whether someone can prove that the sequence being presented publicly is the real sequence or a rearranged sequence that only makes sense until someone checks the timestamps. And if investigators believe the sequence was rearranged, even slightly, that becomes a completely different kind of problem. Because changing a sequence means someone had to know the original sequence first. And that brings this entire story back to Montecito, back to that house, back to the days when everything looked normal from the outside, but now those days are being re-examined hour by hour, and the people who were there during those hours are now part of a timeline instead of just part of a household, staff schedules, security rotations, visitor logs, delivery times, Wi-Fi connections, garage door openings. Everything that seemed meaningless at the time suddenly becomes a timestamp. And the longer this goes on, the more the delay starts to look like the most important decision of all. Because returning while investigators are rebuilding a timeline means answering questions in real time. But staying away means hearing the questions before you have to answer them. And that difference, that small difference, can change everything. It can change legal strategy. It can change who speaks first. It can change who was called a witness and who was called something else. But here is the part nobody is saying out loud yet. If the timeline investigators are building now is different from the timeline they had before, that means new evidence didn't just add information, it changed the story they thought they understood. And when new evidence changes a timeline, investigators don't just adjust the file and move on. They start over from the beginning. Every movement, every call, every message, every flight, every delay. And that means the story is no longer moving forward. It's moving backward, back to the beginning, back to the first movement, back to the first call, back to the first moment when something happened that at the time didn't look important at all. Because the most dangerous moments in any investigation are not the loud moments. They are the quiet moments, the moments nobody remembers clearly, the moments that seemed normal, the moments that only become important later, when someone puts them on a timeline and realizes that normal was not normal at all. And that is why this situation is not calming down, it is tightening, quietly, slowly, methodically. Because while the public is watching headlines and waiting for statements and looking for dramatic confrontations, the real story is being built somewhere much quieter, on a table covered in printed timestamps, where someone is drawing lines between movements and calls and delays, and every time a new line is drawn, the timeline becomes a little clearer and the situation becomes a little more serious. And until that timeline is finished, until every movement fits, until every gap is explained, until every delay makes sense, one question is going to keep hanging over this entire story. The same question that started everything when the timeline was reopened and the return was delayed.